His son Ward actually told stories earlier this year. And now it's time to hear from the old man. So please welcome August Rupert.
Howdy, howdy. I look at this auditorium space, very impressive. A lot different from the little non-denominational church at Clantonville. I feel compelled to talk about that church a little bit because in some ways it's responsible for me being here tonight in the role of storyteller. Otherwise, I might have been a musician. What happened was, Brother Johnson got up one time and he said, "Friends and brethren, we have saved up enough money for a down payment on a piano down to Music Store in Rogers, but we don't have enough money to finish it off, and Lord knows we don't have enough money to have it delivered. So it's going to be a while before we have some music to accompany our sweet-voiced young ladies. We don't want them to have to sing Acapulco anymore." So in the meantime, is there someone in the congregation today who could bring some kind of a musical instrument and play a special music for us next Sunday? Well, at that time I was a big-hearted boy. And I also was showing the first signs of the kind of pathology that brought me to the stage here tonight. I richly desired attention. So I stood up and I said, "Brother Johnson, I've taken up the study of saxophone, and I would be happy to practice all week on Rock of Ages, cleft for me, and play that saxophone next Sunday for special music." He said, "Oh, thank you, Brother Rupert. That is going to be so wonderful." Well, it would have been, maybe, except that my family, my mother and sisters and I lived in a rented house on a chicken farm just across from a bunch of brooder houses. And Ray Hurd, the guy that owned the farm, had put up signs all over the place, said, "Please do not blow horn." Because if people came up and they didn't know where Ray was, they'd honk the horn. And them chickens in those brooder houses, and they were, I don't know, they were 200-300 yards long. The chickens would all run to one end and smother each other, pile up and smother each other. And so he didn't want horns blowed around those chicken houses. Well, we lived down at one end of the chicken houses, across the road from them. And it seemed like every time I would start practicing that saxophone, I would get a call from Ray saying that he needed me to come help unpile the chickens because they had all run to one end of the chicken house and piled up. So I never did get in a full day's practice in that whole week. But I was game, you know, I tried it. Next Sunday, Brother Johnson stood up and he said, "Today we got some special music. We got Brother Rupert playing Rock of Ages, cleft for me on the saxophone." So I stood up and I started blaring away at that horn. It was awful. It was just absolutely terrible. I looked out across the congregation, everybody's jaw dropped like they were trying to catch flies. And as I took a breath to blow the next note, some poor bastard over in the corner forgot all about being in church. All he could think about was his shock at what he had just heard. And he said, "Why, that son of a bitch." You know how that would discourage a young man. And Brother Johnson heard him, of course, because I was taking a breath. He said, Brother Rupert, stop just there a minute. He said, I want the lowly, crass, sinful individual who so forgot himself as to call our saxophone player by such a name to stand up and confess his sin before the entire congregation. Nobody said a word. Dead silence up there for what seemed like 3 or 4 minutes. Couldn't have been near that long, but seemed like it. Finally, somebody in the other corner of the room stood up and he said, Brother Johnson, I don't know who it was that called the saxophone player a son of a bitch. What I want to know is who called that son of a bitch a saxophone player? So that completely discouraged me. And I gave up music. That's why I'm here in this capacity right now. I feel like I ought to tell you something about the history of Brother Johnson when he first came to that part of the country. That was sort of before my time, so I've just heard about that. I can't tell you all the names that are connected with this story, but I can remember the details about the actions, which is the important part. When he first came, an old boy over at Pea Ridge had just died, and he was mean. So mean that none of the preachers around there would preach his sermon. I mean, he was really mean. He would kick dogs. He would cheat widows and orphans. He would vote for Republicans. I mean, tell you, he was mean. Anyway, they couldn't get any preachers to preach his sermon in the entire Pea Ridge area because everybody knew him. And the preachers had enough integrity that they weren't going to hold back because they all had the opinion that he was either headed for hell or already there. And they weren't going to say that in a funeral. But Brother Johnson had just moved in down there at Clantonville, and he didn't know the old boy. So he agreed to do the sermon. Only thing was he didn't know anything about him, so he couldn't do a very thorough sermon. He got up and read all the stuff from the obituary that had been printed in the Pea Ridge Graphic. So he had all the details. And in fact, the editor of the Pea Ridge Graphic was there. He had printed that obituary, and he thought maybe the experience of being at the funeral would straighten him out a little bit on some of the details he hadn't been sure of. And so he was there, and Brother Johnson, after he read the stuff about the biography of the guy, he said, now, I don't know this man, never knew him, and so I can't really say much in detail that would be appropriate to a sermon. And so I'm going to open it up to a testimonial service. And I want anybody in the congregation who has something good to say about this man to stand up and say it. Everybody looked around everybody else. Looked at their fingernails. Looked out the window. Long silence. He said, Brother Johnson says, anybody can say anything neutral. One boy raised his hand and said, well, his brother was worse. I got to tell you about that brother. He died twice. He was really mean.